The sauna's heat was stifling, smothering me like a thick blanket. The heavy air made breathing difficult, my skin slick with perspiration. I sat staring at the wooden planks of the walls, trying to distract myself from the fact that Dan sat only a few feet away. It was supposed to be an ordinary day, nothing unusual. We'd finished our workout at the gym and, as always, decided to hit the sauna. I couldn't explain why today felt different. Perhaps it was the way the heat intensified everything, making the atmosphere feel closer, more intimate. Or maybe it was the silence, punctuated only by the occasional hiss of steam and the rhythm of our breathing. Dan hadn't spoken much since we entered. He sat opposite me, head resting against the wall, eyes closed, a towel draped loosely around his waist. I tried to avoid looking at him, but it was a struggle. The way sweat traced a path down his chest, the subtle flexing of his muscles with each breath, it was captivating. I shifted uncomfortably, the heat radiating off the bench beneath me, my own towel clinging to my damp skin. I couldn't understand my unease. We'd done this countless times. Workout, sauna, casual conversation about nothing in particular. But today, the air crackled with an unspoken tension. "You good, man?" Dan's voice broke the silence, his eyes still closed, his tone casual, as if he hadn't noticed the shift in the atmosphere, as if everything was normal. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing. Yeah, I'm good. But I wasn't. Things had changed, at least for me. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it began, but somewhere along the line, I'd started noticing small details about Dan. The way his laughter filled a room, his playful shoves during our jokes, the lingering glances that held my gaze a little too long. Now, sitting here in the sauna with him, the heat amplifying everything, those thoughts consumed me. I shifted again, searching for a more comfortable position. Within me remained, I glanced at Dan again, his chest rising and falling rhythmically, his lips slightly parted as he exhaled. My heart pounded, then the hiss of the steam. "Why so quiet today?" Dan asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. This time he opened his eyes, turning his head to look at me. I froze, caught off guard by his direct gaze. It was intense, as if he could see straight through me, into the thoughts I was desperately trying to conceal. "I don't know," I mumbled, my throat dry. "Just tired, I guess." Dan's eyes lingered on me for a moment, and I could have sworn I saw something flicker within them, something I couldn't quite decipher. Then he leaned back again, closing his eyes as if satisfied with my answer. I exhaled, releasing a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I tried to dismiss my thoughts, but it was useless. The air in the sauna was too thick, too charged with an unnamed energy that made my skin tingle and my heart race. Dan shifted, adjusting the towel around his waist. For a fleeting second, I thought he glanced at me, his eyes lingering before darting away. My stomach lurched, a wave of heat washing over me that had nothing to do with the sauna. I should have said something, made a joke, laughed it off, pretended everything was normal. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, feeling the space between us shrink even though we weren't moving. Something was happening, something I didn't understand, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. All I knew was that I couldn't tear my gaze away from him, no matter how hard I tried. And deep down, I was terrified of what might happen next. The heat seemed to intensify, pressing down on me, making it difficult to think clearly. My head spun, and I couldn't tell if it was the heat or Dan's presence, which seemed to fill the entire space, stealing the air from my lungs. He moved again, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes flicking towards me, just for a second, but long enough to send my heart racing. I felt the air between us shift. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there, as if the space had become smaller, more intimate. "You've been acting weird lately, man," Dan said, his voice softer now like he was testing the waters. "Everything okay?" There it was, the question I'd been dreading. I'd hoped I could get through this without him noticing, but of course he had. Dan always knew when something was off. That was the problem with being friends for so long. He could read me better than I could read myself. I hesitated, my pulse quickening, trying to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much. But the longer I remained silent, the more apparent it became that I didn't have an answer. I could feel his eyes on me, waiting, and the weight of it was suffocating. "I'm fine," I finally managed, my voice barely steady. I don't know. A lot on my mind." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I wasn't fine, not at all. Because sitting here with him, so close, I couldn't stop the thoughts that had been swirling in my head for weeks, the ones I'd been trying so hard to ignore. Dan leaned back again, watching me intently, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his gaze that made my skin prickle with anticipation. He asked, "What's on your mind?" His voice was casual, but his gaze remained fixed on mine. My stomach lurched. He wasn't letting this go. Not this time. I saw it in his expression, the slight tightening of his jaw, the subtle narrowing of his eyes. He knew I was trying to deflect. I tried to speak, to say anything to change the subject, but the words wouldn't form. I just sat there, the silence between us growing heavier with each passing moment. The heat was intense, not only from the sauna, but from the tension building between us. "Look, Dan," he said, leaning closer, his voice lower and more serious. "If something's going on, you can talk to me. You know that, right?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice. What could I say? That I couldn't stop thinking about him? That lately, I'd been noticing things I shouldn't? That every time we were together, I felt this pull, this confusing mix of excitement and apprehension I couldn't explain? No, I couldn't tell him any of that. Not to him. Not to my best friend. He sat back, and for a second I thought he might drop it. Then he spoke again, and his words stopped my heart. "You're not weirded out by what happened the other night, are you?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The other night. I had almost managed to forget. Almost. But his bringing it up now brought it all flooding back. It was late, after a night out with friends. We were both drunk, laughing about something silly as we stumbled back to his apartment. One minute we were joking, the next. I didn't know how it happened, but suddenly we were too close. For a fleeting moment, I thought he was going to kiss me. He didn't. We laughed it off, pretending nothing happened. I'd convinced myself it was all in my imagination. But now, sitting here in the sauna with him staring at me, I wasn't so sure. "No," I stammered, trying to steady my voice. "I mean, it was nothing, right?" He didn't answer immediately. He just looked at me, his eyes searching mine, trying to decipher my thoughts. Then he smiled, that easy smile that always made everything feel okay, even when it wasn't. "Yeah," he said, leaning back against the wall. It was nothing. But the way he said it, the way his eyes lingered on mine for a beat too long, told me that maybe it wasn't nothing. Not for him, and definitely not for me. The air between us felt thicker, like we were standing on the precipice of something we both recognized but were afraid to acknowledge. I swallowed, trying to push the thoughts away, but they were relentless, making it impossible to concentrate. He shifted again, sitting up straighter, his gaze still fixed on me. The space between us seemed to shrink, even though neither of us had moved. I could feel my heart pounding, the heat of the sauna mingling with the heat between us, making it hard to breathe. "So, we're good?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I nodded, unsure if I was being truthful. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, but neither of us seemed willing to break it. He sat there, his eyes on me, waiting for something, an answer, a sign, anything that would tell him what I was really thinking. But I didn't have it. I didn't know what to say, what to feel. All I knew was that something was about to happen, something I couldn't stop. I felt trapped, the sauna's heat pressing down, making each breath a struggle. My skin was slick with perspiration, and I couldn't tell if it was from the heat or the tension coiling inside me. I couldn't think straight, couldn't focus on anything but the fact that he was right there so close, and I had no idea what was going to happen next. "We're good," I finally managed, my voice barely a whisper. I wasn't sure I believed it. The words felt empty, like they didn't belong to me. He didn't move for a moment, just stared at me with that same unreadable expression. Then slowly, he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "You sure about that?" he asked, his voice low, almost a challenge. I swallowed, my throat dry. "Yeah, I'm sure." But I wasn't. Not even close. Because the truth was, I had no idea what I was feeling, no idea what I wanted. All I knew was that the space between us felt too small, too charged with something I didn't want to name, and the way he was looking at me, like he could see right through me, wasn't helping. He leaned back again, his body relaxed, but his eyes still focused on me, watching, waiting. I shifted uncomfortably, trying to break the tension, but it was no use. It was like the air between us had solidified, trapping us in this moment. Then, without warning, he stood up. The sudden movement startled me, and I looked up at him, my heart racing. For a second, I thought he was going to leave, that he'd finally had enough of this strange, silent tension. But he didn't. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But Dan stood there, barely a foot away, his chest rising and falling steadily. He didn't speak, didn't move to close the remaining distance. He simply watched me, expectant. My mind raced, scrambling for something to do or say, but I couldn't think. I just sat there, the heat of the sauna intensifying with the warmth radiating from him, making it impossible to focus. Then, slowly, he crouched before me, his eyes locked on mine. His expression was serious, but there was something else there too, something deeper that made my heart pound. "You can tell me if something's going on," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the hiss of the steam. "You don't have to hide it." I opened my mouth, intending to deflect, to laugh it off as I always did, but the words wouldn't come. In that moment, all I could think about was his proximity, how the space between us had vanished. His hand moved then, just slightly, resting on the bench beside me, his fingers brushing my knee. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I should have pulled away, should have said something, anything, to interrupt the moment, to stop whatever this was before it escalated. But I didn't. I remained frozen, my heart hammering, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to acknowledge. "I'm serious, Dan," he said, his voice soft but firm. "If something's bothering you, you can talk to me. I'm not going anywhere." His hand remained beside mine, close enough that I could feel the heat emanating from him. For a fleeting second, I imagined reaching out, closing the distance between us. The thought made my stomach churn, and I forced myself to look away, to break the intensity of his gaze. But even as I averted my eyes, I could still feel his presence, overwhelming, his hand so close it made my skin tingle. I swallowed, trying to dismiss the thoughts, but they returned, relentless. This was Dan, my best friend. I couldn't be thinking like this. It wasn't right. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop the way my heart raced whenever he was near, the way my body reacted to the slightest touch, the way my mind kept returning to that night, that moment when everything had almost shifted. And now, sitting here in the sauna with him so close, I knew things were about to change again. "I'm fine," I mumbled, the words hollow and unconvincing. He didn't respond immediately. He just looked at me, searching my eyes as if waiting for me to say something more, to admit what was truly happening. But I couldn't. I wasn't ready. Not yet. He didn't move, remaining crouched before me, so close I could feel the heat of his skin, the steady rhythm of his breath. My own breathing was shallow and uneven, and I couldn't tear my gaze away from him. "I don't believe you," he said softly, his voice low, almost a whisper. I know something's going on. There it was again, that calm, serious tone that always affected me. It wasn't just the words, but the way he delivered them, like he already knew what I was thinking but was giving me the opportunity to confess. He had a way of seeing through people, and right now I felt completely exposed. My heart hammered in my chest, the sauna's heat making it harder to think clearly. My mind raced, urging me to say something, anything, to break the spell, but I was frozen, trapped by the weight of the moment. His hand shifted again, this time resting gently on my knee. His touch was light, but enough to send another jolt through me. I swallowed, my throat dry, and looked down at his hand. The simple, casual gesture now felt like the most significant thing in the room. My voice faltered, and I couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't move, didn't pull his hand away. Instead, he leaned in slightly, closing the distance between us almost entirely. His face was inches from mine, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. "You can talk to me," he said again, quieter this time, more insistent. I closed my eyes, trying to shut everything out, but it was useless. The tension was unbearable, thick and heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. My mind raced, and the only thought that kept recurring was that I needed to stop this, needed to get out before things went any further, before we crossed a line neither of us could return from. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could only sit there, my body betraying me, my heart pounding louder than the hissing steam. And then it happened. His hand moved from my knee, sliding up slightly, his fingers brushing against my thigh. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it was enough to shatter something inside me, enough to make everything I had been trying to ignore, everything I had been pushing down, come crashing down all at once. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. His eyes were on mine, dark and intense, and in that moment, I knew. I knew this wasn't just in my head. He felt it too, the pull, the tension, the unspoken connection that had been growing between us for weeks. My heart raced, a mixture of fear and something else I didn't want to name. But the way he was looking at me now, the way his hand lingered just a fraction too long, I couldn't deny what was happening. I should have pulled away, said something to stop it before it went any further. But I didn't. I couldn't. I remained frozen, watching him, waiting to see what he'd do next. Dan hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching mine, offering me a final chance to back out. But I didn't. I couldn't. And in that instant, everything changed. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned closer, his face inches from mine. I felt the heat radiating from him, the tension almost unbearable. My breath hitched, and my hands trembled slightly, adrenaline surging through me. Then, without warning, his lips brushed against mine. It was soft, almost hesitant, as if he were testing the waters, gauging my reaction. For a split second, everything froze. The world seemed to stop, the sauna's heat vanished. The only thing I could focus on was him. His lips, his breath, the way his hand tightened slightly on my leg. I should have pulled away, pushed him back, stopped it. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back. It was like a switch had flipped inside me, everything I'd been suppressing for weeks crashing through the barriers I'd built. I leaned into the kiss, my hand rising to rest on his arm, pulling him closer without a second thought. He responded instantly, his hand sliding further up my thigh as he deepened the kiss, his body pressing against mine. It was raw, intense, as if all the pent-up tension between us had finally snapped, and there was no turning back. I didn't care about the consequences, didn't care about what this meant for our friendship. In that moment, all that mattered was him. The feel of his lips on mine, his hands on me, the heat between us making it impossible to think clearly. Everything else faded, the world outside the sauna, the years of friendship, the uncertainty of what would happen next. None of it mattered. All that mattered was this, him, Us. And I knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same. We pulled apart, breathless, the heat between us even more intense. The room felt like it was spinning. My heart raced, pounding so hard I thought it might burst. His face was still close, his breath coming in shallow, quick gasps. I could feel the weight of what had just happened settle between us like a dense fog. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, the silence of the sauna pressing down on us, our chests rising and falling in unison. My mind was a whirlwind, trying to process what had just occurred, trying to comprehend the fact that I had just kissed my best friend. And not just kissed him, wanted him. His hand remained on my leg, but the energy between us had shifted. It wasn't just about the heat or the tension anymore. It was something deeper, something neither of us had been prepared for, but couldn't deny any longer. I started to speak, but my voice cracked, betraying the confusion and fear churning inside me. I didn't know what to say, how to explain this. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look me in the eye. His expression was serious, but there was a softness there, something I hadn't seen before. His hand lingered on my leg a moment longer before he finally withdrew it, sitting back on the bench across from me. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken words, with everything we weren't saying but desperately needed to. I wanted to ask him what this meant, what we were supposed to do now, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, my mind racing with questions I was too afraid to ask. He was the first to speak. His voice was low, cautious, as if he were treading on broken glass. That wasn't nothing, was it? I shook my head, unable to trust my voice. It hadn't been nothing. It had been everything. He nodded, his eyes still locked on mine. For an instant I saw something flicker there. Fear, uncertainty, the same emotions that were twisting inside me. I've been thinking about it, he admitted quietly, his voice barely a whisper over the hissing steam. For a while now, my stomach lurched at his words. I'd been trying so hard to convince myself it was all in my head, that the tension between us was just me overthinking. But hearing him say it aloud, knowing he'd been feeling the same way, made everything feel even more real, even more terrifying. Me too, I whispered, my voice finally steady enough to speak. He didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, staring at me as if trying to decide what to do next. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same conflict I felt. We both knew what had happened, but neither of us knew what it meant, or what came next. "What do we do now?" I asked, the question hanging heavy in the air between us. He exhaled slowly, leaning back against the bench, his gaze drifting to the ceiling for a moment before returning to me. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I don't think we can just pretend this didn't happen." I nodded, my stomach twisting into knots. I didn't want to pretend, but I also had no idea what to do. Our entire friendship had just shifted, and there was no going back. The question was, could we move forward? And what would that even look like? "I don't want to mess this up," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes softened, and for the first time since we'd entered the sauna, his smile was slight, almost hesitant, yet it was enough to send my pulse racing once more. "We won't," he declared, his voice now firm. "We won't." He sounded so certain, but I wasn't. I couldn't process it. The kiss, the emotions I'd suppressed for so long, the sudden eruption of everything between us. None of it made sense, but one thing was crystal clear. Things between Dan and me would never be the same. Dan rose, his towel slipping slightly as he adjusted it, his gaze locked on mine. "We'll work it out," he said softly. "I promise." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe we could navigate this, that we could move forward without it all collapsing. But deep down, I knew this was larger than both of us. The connection, the feelings we'd denied for so long, were too powerful to ignore any longer. He extended a hand, and after a brief hesitation, I took it. His grip was strong, reassuring. As he pulled me up from the bench, a strange sense of relief washed over me. Maybe he was right. Maybe we could figure this out. As we exited the SAA, the cool air hit my skin like a jolt, and I realized everything had shifted. But for the first time in weeks, I wasn't scared. I wasn't afraid of what came next, because whatever it was, we'd face it together.